The idea started as nothing more than a late-night conversation between forensic experts and paranormal investigators. Dr. Alan Graves, a seasoned forensic scientist, had spent years studying decomposition, but there were always questions that remained unanswered. Strange inconsistencies. Cases where bodies showed signs of unexplained movement after burial. Then there were the old tales, whispers of something stirring beneath the soil, of faint knocks heard from the earth, and of coffins found disturbed without explanation. It was purely scientific at first. A camera, small enough to fit discreetly inside a coffin, would be placed alongside a recently deceased body. The goal was simple: to document the first 72 hours of the decomposition process from inside, something never attempted before. But as word spread, others became interested, particularly a group of paranormal researchers who had spent years collecting stories of premature burials and unexplainable post-mortem activity. They wanted to see if there was any truth to the folklore. Dr. Graves was skeptical of the paranormal aspect, but he agreed. A local morgue provided an unclaimed body, a man in his 40s who had died of a heart attack. No known family, no one to object. The burial would be held at an old cemetery on the outskirts of town, where the ground had long since hardened with age, and the graves were rarely visited. The body was placed in a simple wooden coffin, and a small, high-definition camera was discreetly embedded into the lid, angled downward. A motion sensor would activate it if anything moved. The team gathered at the burial site as the coffin was lowered into the grave. A live feed was connected to their monitoring equipment above ground, though the signal would likely become patchy as soil covered the coffin. As the last shovel of dirt was packed over the grave, the camera feed flickered, then went dark. The team retreated to their monitoring station, expecting little more than hours of silence and the slow, inevitable stillness of death. But what they saw defied all logic. At first, the footage was as expected. The camera's infrared mode illuminated confined space in eerie shades of gray. The body lay motionless, its features gaunt and lifeless. Minutes passed, then hours. The team watched as insects began their work, the natural process of decay taking hold. Then, just after midnight, the camera glitched. For a moment, static washed over the screen, distorting the image. When the feed cleared, the body's position had changed. At first, it was subtle, a shift in the angle of the head. The right arm, which had been resting across the chest, now seemed slightly raised. Dr. Graves leaned closer, frowning. It could have been settling. Graves often shifted, would groan, body slumped. There were logical explanations. But then, the fingers twitched. The motion sensor triggered a timestamp, 12:03 a.m. Everyone in the room fell silent. The movement was slight, but undeniable. The fingers curled inwards, as if grasping for something unseen. Then, the hand fell limp again. One of the paranormal researchers, a woman named Lillian Rhodes, whispered under her breath, "Did anyone see that?" Dr. Graves hesitated before replying. Bodies can have post-mortem spasms. It's not uncommon. No one was convinced. The team continued to watch, unease settling over them. The camera's night vision cast everything in stark contrast, making the stillness of the coffin even more oppressive. Then, at 1:15 a.m., another movement. This time, the body's mouth opened. Not slightly, not a natural relaxation of muscles. It was a slow, deliberate widening of the jaw, as if gasping for air. A cold chill spread through the room. Someone muttered a curse. Dr. Graves leaned forward, eyes narrowing. This doesn't make sense. Lillian's voice was barely above a whisper. What if he wasn't dead? No one responded. The thought alone was terrifying. The body had been examined, declared dead by a coroner. No pulse, no respiration. The cause of death had been confirmed. There was no possibility of error, right? And yet, the footage told a different story. Then the camera glitched again. This time, the distortion lasted longer, the screen warping into static. When the image returned, something was different. The coffin lid had deep scratches on the inside, but they hadn't been there before. Dr. Graves immediately rewound the footage, scanning through the previous minutes. There had been no movement strong enough to cause that level of damage. And yet, the scratches were fresh, deep gouges in the wood, as if someone had been clawing desperately at it. That was when the whispering began. At first, it was faint, almost indistinguishable from the static. A garbled sound, like distant voices carried through water. The team turned up the volume. The sound grew clearer. It was a voice, and it was coming from inside the coffin. The words were fragmented, strained. A single phrase repeated over and over again. "Let me out! Let me out! Let me out!" The room was dead silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Then, as they watched, the screen flickered again. The corpse was sitting up. A scream tore through the monitoring room as the feed cut to black. The feed remained black for what seemed like an eternity. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the sound of shallow breathing and the frantic tapping of fingers on keyboards. Lillian Rhodes, who had initially suggested the possibility of a paranormal explanation, was now visibly shaken, her hands trembling as she stared at the black screen. Dr. Graves, usually calm and collected, was pacing back and forth, his mind racing through every possible explanation. He had spent years studying the decomposition process. Nothing about this made sense. The body had been completely still hours before. The camera feed had been stable, showing the gradual onset of decay. So why now? Why this sudden, impossible movement? "Get the feed back up," he ordered. His voice was tight with frustration and growing fear. A technician worked furiously at the console, readjusting wires and rebooting the system. Moments later, the screen flickered, and the footage returned. This time, the camera's perspective was darker, grainier, almost impossible to make sense of. But through the distortion, one thing was clear. The coffin was no longer undisturbed. The body, now sitting upright, had its hands pressed against the inside of the lid, fingers desperately clawing at the wood. The slow, deliberate motion of the body had a terrifying quality, a sense of willpower behind it that defied natural law. But it wasn't just the body that was alarming. It was the sound. A low, guttural rasping noise emanated from the coffin. The soft scrape of nails against wood, mixed with faint murmurs, made the air in the room grow thick. The experts in the room exchanged uneasy glances. What they were witnessing was no longer part of any documented phenomenon. Dr. Graves adjusted his glasses, his throat tight. "No, this can't be happening." His voice was barely above a whisper. "The body's supposed to be—" Lillian interrupted him, her eyes wide with fear. "What if it's something else?" Dr. Graves swallowed hard, trying to dismiss her suggestion. "There has to be a logical explanation. We need to get a closer look. There must be something wrong with the feed. A glitch." The technician zoomed in on the footage, and as the camera's lens focused on the body's face, a new, horrific detail emerged. The corpse's eyes, once wide open, had slowly narrowed. The pupils were no longer fixed. They were tracking. The eyes of the dead man, eyes that should have been lifeless, were moving. Lillian let out a strangled gasp. "This isn't possible." Her voice quivered, and she staggered back from the console. "Dead bodies don't do that." But there it was. The body's eyes rolled, slowly focusing on something unseen. Then they shifted again as if searching for something. The eerie rasping noises continued, growing louder, more frantic. Dr. Graves' hands clenched into fists, knuckles turning white. He'd seen strange things in his years of work, but this was beyond any natural law. "It's a malfunction. It has to be." He muttered to himself, more to reassure himself than anyone else. But as he said it, the body's mouth opened again. This time, it wasn't a subtle movement. The jaw unhinged, the lips stretched impossibly wide, as if the skin was being torn apart from the inside. A sickening crack echoed through the room. The body's mouth, gaping and unnatural, now seemed to whisper. The words were clearer this time, though still disjointed and garbled. "Let me out! Let me out!" The voice, if it could even be called that, was raw, rasping, as though it came from the depths of the earth itself. It sounded desperate. It sounded alive. Lillian clutched her chest, her breath shallow. "This is wrong. This is so wrong." Dr. Graves remained frozen, staring at the screen, unable to tear his eyes away. There was no logical explanation for what was happening. He had spent years studying death, but this was beyond understanding. He had to know more. He had to get to the bottom of it. Stop it. Stop the feed now. Dr. Graves' voice was cold now, steady. He was in control, at least outwardly. But the technician didn't respond. He was too transfixed by the screen, his face pale. It won't stop, he whispered. The camera is not responding. The feed is locked. Lock it? What do you mean, lock it? Dr. Graves snapped, panic creeping into his voice. It's like the technician swallowed hard, his eyes wide with disbelief. The camera is alive. The words hung in the air. The room grew colder, the temperature dropping as if something was pulling the warmth from space. The whispers from the coffin grew louder, each repeated plea now punctuated by louder knocks, the sound of something pounding from the inside. And then the screen went dark again. This time it wasn't a glitch. The feed had been cut. A sudden bang at the door startled everyone. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. Someone was coming. Dr. Graves turned sharply toward the door. He hadn't heard anyone approach, but now there was no mistaking the sound of someone or something moving swiftly towards a room. The door creaked open. A man in a black suit entered, his face grim. It was Detective Mark Ramsey, the officer assigned to investigate strange occurrences at the cemetery. "We have a problem," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Another body's gone missing." Lillian's blood ran cold. What do you mean, gone missing?" Detective Ramsey looked at them with a grave expression. "There's a grave just outside the cemetery. The coffin's been opened." Everyone froze. There was no sign of disturbance in the dirt, just an empty coffin, and a few footprints leading toward the woods. The camera feed flickered back on, and in the background of the grainy footage, a shadow shifted. The figure of a man, pale, thin, and limping, was walking away from the grave. The whispering in the coffin grew louder. The thing inside was no longer asking to be let out. It was already free. To be continued. The room erupted into chaos. Detective Ramsey's words hung in the air like a death sentence. But it wasn't just a graveyard incident that was disturbing. The footage, now clearer but more unsettling than ever, revealed a silhouette emerging from the grave. The thin, lifeless form dragging itself through the underbrush of the woods. It moved with unnatural jerks, as if its limbs were not in full control, yet was undeniably alive. Lillian's face was pale, her mouth trembling as she stared at the screen. "It can't be," she whispered. "It's impossible." Dr. Graves, however, was already in motion, his mind racing. The body in the coffin, the scratches, the whispers, they were all part of something far darker than a simple medical anomaly. He had to know more. He had to understand what had happened. This wasn't just about death anymore. It was something else. "We need to go to the cemetery. Now," Dr. Graves said, his voice firm, but the edge of fear was creeping into it. Ramsey nodded, already heading for the door. "You're right. We're not just talking about a missing body anymore. We're dealing with something." His voice faltered as he glanced at the footage. Something else. Lillian stood still, staring at the grainy image of the figure disappearing into the woods. "What happened to camera feed?" she asked, her voice breaking. "It's not just a body that's moving. It's the camera itself. How can it have gone dark?" Dr. Graves shook his head. "We're not sure yet, but whatever's happening, it's not just some glitch or mistake. The camera was fine. Now it's responding, or controlling things." The tension in the room was palpable as they made their way to the cemetery, the weight of the situation hanging over them like a dark cloud. The woods were dense, the trees black in silhouettes against the eerie light of a fading moon. Every step seemed to echo in the still night air, as if the forest itself was listening. They arrived at the cemetery, the fog that had rolled in thickening with each passing minute. The site where the grave had been was eerily quiet, the soil undisturbed except for the empty coffin lying in the hole. It was as if the body had vanished into thin air. "Look," Ramsey said, pointing to the ground near the edge of the grave. "The faintest trace of footprints. barely visible, led off into the woods. The soil was loose where the body had supposedly risen, but the trail was too faint to make sense of. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a faint, chilling voice that seemed to call out from the darkness. The sound was soft at first, a near imperceptible murmur, but it grew louder, repeating the same 3 words. "Let me out! Let me out! Let me out!" Lillian clutched her coat tighter, shivering from more than just the cold. "It's coming from the woods," she said, her voice trembling. "We have to follow those tracks. Whatever it is, it's not far." Dr. Graves nodded, the urgency of the situation settling in. "Stay close. And whatever you do, don't let it out of your sight." They followed the trail into the woods, the trees growing denser as the path wound deeper into the dark forest. The air grew colder, the dampness of the earth seeping into their bones. Each step was slower now, more cautious, as if the ground itself was resisting their movement. Then, just as they reached the edge of a small clearing, they saw it, a figure, standing motionless in the center of the clearing. It was the same corpse, the man who had been buried earlier that night. He was standing upright, his body contorted in ways that defied logic. His limbs were unnaturally stiff, his head tilted at an angle that made his neck appear broken. His eyes were wide open, though lifeless and empty. Yet somehow they were staring directly at the group. Dr. Graves took a step forward, his heart pounding. "What is this? How is this possible?" The man's lips parted again, though this time the whispering was no longer faint. It was loud, a guttural rasping that seemed to come from deep within the earth. "Let me out! Let me out! Let me out!" The words were now distorted, as if they were being forced out of a throat that wasn't meant to speak. It was more than a plea. It was an order. The body's chest heaved once, twice, as if gasping for air. The limbs twitched, and then, without warning, the man's hand shot out, fingers clawing at the air, reaching for the group. Lillian screamed and stumbled back, but Dr. Graves was frozen, unable to look away. It wasn't just a movement that terrified him. It was the look in the eyes. They weren't the vacant, lifeless eyes of a corpse. They were full of awareness, of a presence that was undeniably human. I don't understand," Lillian stammered. "What's happening? What are we dealing with?" The figure took a slow step toward them, its joints creaking, bones grinding as if the body was not meant to move. The ground beneath it seemed to tremble, the trees around them shifting as though responding to the unnatural presence. "We need to go back. Now," Ramsey urged, his voice tight. This is beyond us. This is not just a body. It's something else." But Dr. Graves stood his ground. He wasn't sure if it was curiosity or the need to understand, but something in him refused to leave. "No, we need answers. It's not just about the body. It's about the camera, the feed. Everything is connected. It's not coincidence." Lillian grabbed his arm, her grip tight with fear. "Dr. Graves, you're not thinking clearly. This thing, it's not a man. Whatever it is, it's not alive." But before he could respond, the figure lunged forward, its body twisting grotesquely, limbs jerking in a desperate attempt to close the distance. The air grew heavy, suffocating, and the whispers of the dead man grew louder, filling their minds. The world around them seemed to distort, as if the boundaries of reality itself were slipping away. In that moment, they realized the truth. This was no longer a matter of science. It wasn't a malfunction. It wasn't even just a resurrection. Whatever was inside the coffin had been waiting, and now it was free. The figure that had once been a corpse moved toward them with unnatural speed, its body jerking violently with each step. The air was thick with tension as its eyes, those empty, haunting eyes, locked onto Dr. Graves. The whispers echoed louder now, a cacophony of desperate, frantic sounds, as if the body itself was screaming, but the voice that reached their ears was almost too low to understand. "Get away from it, Graves!" Ramsey shouted, his voice sharp with panic. But Dr. Graves was rooted in place, unable to tear his eyes away from the thing before him. It wasn't just the body that frightened him anymore, it was what it represented. This thing wasn't merely a reanimated corpse. It was something other, something ancient, something he couldn't explain with the knowledge he had accumulated over the years. Lillian stumbled backward, pulling on Dr. Graves' arm. "We have to go. It's not just dangerous. It's alive. Whatever is in that body, it's not human." But Dr. Graves shook his head, as if snapping out of a trance. "No, it can't be. This isn't natural." His voice faltered, almost as if he was trying to convince himself. "I need to understand. This is what I've been studying my whole life. This changes everything." Ramsey, now visibly sweating, yanked at Lillian's arm, trying to pull her away from the horrific scene. "You're not thinking straight, Graves. Whatever's happening here, we can't stay. This is beyond us. It's beyond science." The figure continued its relentless approach, its limbs twisting at impossible angles. Its mouth stretched wide once more, but this time the words were clearer. "I have been trapped. You don't understand. I've been waiting." The words, no, the screams, sent a wave of unease through them. It wasn't a body coming back from the dead. This wasn't some zombie. This was something far darker, far more sentient. Dr. Graves' mind raced. The camera, the footage, it was never just about the body. It was a vessel. It's connected. The burial was just a trigger. The camera captured it. The body, this body, was waiting for the right moment to break free. Lillian's breath caught in her throat as she watched the thing move closer. "What do you mean? Waiting? Waiting for what?" "It wanted out," Dr. Graves murmured, almost to himself. His eyes were wide with realization. That's it. The body wasn't just inanimate. It was a prison. And the camera, it was the key. As the thing lurched toward them, a sickening, clicking sound filled the air, bones grinding against each other. Its eyes locked onto Dr. Graves again, unblinking, unfeeling, but undeniably aware. "I need it back," the figure rasped, its voice low and tortured. "The camera? I need the camera." Suddenly, everything clicked. The unnatural movements, the whispers, the intelligence behind the body's actions. This was no longer about the dead returning to life. It was something far more insidious. The body in the coffin had been chosen. The camera had been placed there for a reason. No. The voice was clear, and now it was commanding. "You cannot stop it. It will come for you, all of you." The words felt like they were being driven into their skulls. The force of the command was undeniable. The thing was more than just a reanimated corpse. It was an ancient force, a presence that had been sealed away, buried and forgotten, but now free. Dr. Graves stumbled backward, his heart racing. "We have to destroy the footage. The camera it's alive somehow. It's been recording, yes, but it's been more than just a witness. It's a portal." The words seemed to echo through the forest as the creature advanced. It was almost upon them now, its movements erratic but full of purpose. It seemed to understand their fear. "We're trapped," Lillian whispered. The cold realization of it all crept up her spine. It's not just trying to escape. It's hunting us. All of us. But before Dr. Graves could respond, a screech filled the air, the sound of something being torn apart. Ramsey, who had been trying to back away, suddenly collapsed to the ground, his body convulsing violently. His screams mixed with the sinister whispers of the thing as it reached down toward him, its hands pulling at his limbs. The forest seemed to come alive around them, the shadows shifting unnaturally. "No!" Lillian cried, reaching out for him, but she was too late. Ramsey's body twisted and contorted, as if it were being drawn into the earth itself. His final scream was cut off as the thing dragged him into the ground, leaving only the hollow echo of his voice behind. The ground was still. For a moment, everything was silent. The thing, now fully awake, stood motionless, its eyes scanning the clearing. It tilted its head toward Dr. Graves and Lillian, its mouth opening in a wide, unnatural grin. It wasn't hungry. It wasn't angry. It was satisfied. "You will never escape," it whispered again, its voice becoming a symphony of despair, its tone echoing through the forest. "I am free." Lillian grabbed Dr. Graves' arm, pulling him away. "We need to leave. This thing, it's not just about the body. We're not dealing with a man anymore. This is something older, far older." Dr. Graves shook his head, his mind reeling. "I don't understand. How could I have missed it? The camera wasn't just a tool, it was a conduit. This was all part of his plan. They backed away slowly, their eyes never leaving the thing standing in the clearing. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. It had won. But as they turned to leave, Dr. Graves glanced over his shoulder. For just a moment, he thought he saw a shadow shifting behind the thing. Something more. A figure, cloaked in darkness. Silent. Watching. And for the first time, Dr. Graves realized the truth. The camera wasn't the only thing that had been waiting. The thing that had been sealed away, buried in that coffin, was part of something larger. It had been part of a plan far beyond their understanding. A plan that had already begun to unfold. The night felt endless. Dr. Graves and Lillian moved quickly through the woods, their hearts pounding in their chests. But no matter how fast they ran, the oppressive weight of what they had just witnessed pressed down on them. The trees seemed to close in around them, their shadows stretching like long, skeletal fingers that reached for their souls. The air was suffocating. Each breath harder to take as the whispers grew louder in their minds, their meaning unclear, but their presence undeniable. Behind them, the creature in the clearing stood unmoving, its hollow eyes staring in their direction, as if waiting, watching. It had let them go, at least for now. But for how long? The camera's presence, that infernal device, had allowed it to break free, to escape the confines of an eternal prison. And now that it was free, there was no telling what horrors it would bring. Dr. Graves stopped abruptly, his chest heaving with panic. He turned toward Lillian, his face pale, the horror of their situation catching up to him. We can't keep running. There's nowhere left to hide. Lillian shook her head, her voice strained. What do you mean? We need to get out of here. We have to warn someone. There has to be a way to stop it. Dr. Graves looked at her with grim determination. It's too late for that. We've seen too much. This thing, it's not just a monster. It's part of something bigger, something that we don't understand. The camera, it wasn't a mistake. It was the key to unlocking a much older evil. Lillian's stomach twisted at his words. What do you mean? What is it? Dr. Graves swallowed hard, tried to find the words to explain the enormity of what they were up against. That figure, the one in the clearing, it's a vessel. It was never meant to be human. The body that we thought was being buried. It's a conduit, a connection to something ancient. The camera didn't just record. It summoned. And now that thing is free. But it's not alone. Lillian felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The silence around them seemed to deepen, the very air growing heavier. What do you mean, not alone? What is this thing? Dr. Graves took a deep breath, his voice trembling now. It's not just one being. It's a collective. It's a force. A presence that has been waiting for centuries to be released. The camera didn't just capture the dead body. It triggered something that has been lying dormant, buried beneath layers of time. And now that it's awake, we have no idea how far it reaches. The weight of his words hung in the air, suffocating her. Lillian opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, there was a loud crack, followed by a distant growl. Both of them turned quickly, the terror in their eyes matching the growl that had come from the depths of the woods. Something was moving toward them, fast. It's coming, Dr. Graves whispered, his voice barely audible. We're not alone in these woods anymore. They ran as fast as they could, but the ground beneath their feet felt like it was shifting, pulling them back, dragging them into the darkness. The shadows seemed to stretch longer and longer with every step they took. Every rustling of the trees, every snap of a branch, felt like a reminder that something was chasing them. As they pushed forward, their breath ragged and their legs screaming in pain. Lillian dared to glance behind them. The woods seemed to be alive, the trees twisting and bending unnaturally as if they, too, were under the influence of whatever force had been unleashed. The shadows moved faster, swarming toward them. Then, in the distance, she saw it. A shape, a dark silhouette that seemed to merge with the very darkness of the woods. It was not just one figure. It was many. Dr. Graves turned to look as well, his expression hardening. It's them, the ones that were buried with it. The camera didn't just release the one. It released them all. The creatures began to emerge from the shadows. Their movements were jagged and unnatural, limbs snapping into place as they approached. They were the same as the one in the clearing, but there were more now. Too many to count. Lillian could barely keep her footing as she ran, but she could hear them getting closer. The sound of their feet shuffling through the underbrush was like the thud of a drum, growing louder with every second. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, each beat syncing with the horrific rhythm of their steps. Then, suddenly, the forest seemed to open up before them. A clearing, but there was no safety here. No escape. In the center of the clearing stood the thing they had feared most, the camera. It was on a pedestal, old and cracked, but it was glowing now, its faint light pulsing in time with the movements of the creatures. It was as though the camera was calling to them, drawing them closer, beckoning them toward the very darkness they had tried to outrun. Dr. Graves stared at the camera, his mind racing. It's here. We need to destroy it. We have to destroy it, or all of this will continue. But before he could move, the creatures surrounded them, closing in from all sides. They were too fast, too numerous. Lillian screamed as one of the figures lunged at her, its cold, lifeless fingers grabbing hold of her arm. No, Dr. Graves shouted, trying to break free from the grasp of another creature. But it was no use. They were everywhere, pulling them toward the camera, toward the source of the evil that had been unleashed. As the darkness closed in, Lillian felt her heart drop into her stomach. She turned to Dr. Graves, her voice filled with terror and regret. We failed. We should have never gotten involved. We should have never opened the coffin. But Dr. Graves, his eyes wide with realization, only whispered one thing before they were engulfed by the darkness. It was never meant to be stopped. And as the world around them went black, they understood the terrifying truth. The camera wasn't just a tool for recording. It was a window, a portal to a realm that had been closed off for centuries, a realm where the dead no longer stayed buried, where forces beyond comprehension ruled. And now, the camera had unlocked it all.